Our Bible reading this morning comes from 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 15 and 16. But in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you, to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect, keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behaviour in Christ may be ashamed of their slander.
So this is a repeat of the Faith and Reason talk I gave at Christ the Rock on the 12th of May. So we're re-recording at a later date. So I wanted to talk about faith and reason. I think it's an important topic because you can hear in some quarters the view that having a religious faith is at odds with believing in facts and logic and being a person of science, but I don't think that's true at all. I don't think a religious faith and reason and logic are in opposition at all. I think all of us at the church have a faith, but it's not a blind faith. If we had time to go around and speak to everyone, we'd probably find dozens and even hundreds of rational reasons why people are Christians. People might explain about how they had answered prayers that really made them think Christianity was true and God was there. They might have had an epiphany in a quiet time they had with God, believe that God was there. There's all sorts of reasons. So I wanted to go through and try and point out some of the sound footings we have, reasons why we can believe with credibility that there is substance to our faith. So on this slide here, in 1 Peter, it talks about how Christians are called to give a defense to anyone who asks us about our faith. And I think that's a real challenge to Christians. I always find it hard to think what to say when I'm in company, when I'm being asked to describe why I'm a Christian. I'm hoping some of the ideas that I present in this talk might give us ammunition for bringing up useful topics and explaining why we are Christians. So as I said, there's all sorts of reasons why people become Christians. There's spiritual and emotional components, but it's only the intellectual component I'm dealing with today in this talk. So if you could cast your minds back, if you're old enough, to the year 1993, and if you're not, you have to imagine what life was like then. That was a year when I left home to go off to university for the first time. It was a useful period for questioning my faith because I'd only recently become a Christian. It's a good time of thinking through various ideas. But also, I was to invent something during that time. I was to play far too much of a board game that's healthy. I was to learn something profound. Set the scene. Here's some of the things that went on in 1993. So Jurassic Park was the most popular film. Shane Warne's Ball of the Century. Man United became champions. When I presented this at the church, I asked the congregation to suggest who might have sang the number one Christmas song. And people provided all sorts of answers. And I gave them a clue that the number one Christmas song was sung by a male solo artist. But no one got it in the end, so I had to reveal that the number one song at Christmas that year was sung by, in fact, Mr. Blobby. So I said that I played far too much that was healthy of a particular board game. So that the board game was Monopoly. I was studying to do a maths degree. So we were learning to apply the laws of probability to the board game Monopoly and to work out an optimum strategy. So I used to play long hours of the game with anyone I could coax into playing, and also played long hours on my own deep into the evening. People talk about how their university days were crazy, wild times when they let off a leash, not being at home anymore. So I think this is about as crazy as I got during that time, playing far too much of Monopoly on my own. I also learned during that time that clothes don't wash themselves unless your mum's in the house. And I said I invented something. So here's the thing I invented during my time at university. So I frequently found that I'd get up far too late to go to lectures. I wouldn't give myself time to get breakfast. So I discovered that using the resources at my disposal, i.e. biscuits and jam, I could make a perfectly functionable, transportable snack. So if I made a couple of these, ate them on my way to lectures, I could enjoy 3 hours of calculus without having an empty stomach. So these points I've just mentioned may be interesting-ish up to a point, but why am I telling you this? Well, the profound thing I learnt during university was this. We learnt about this guy, Blaise Pascal, who lived a long time ago, and he was considered quite the polymath. If you've learnt maths, you might recognise Pascal's triangles. Well, that's the same guy, Pascal. And if you've learned much about physics, you'll know the Pascal is a unit of measurement of pressure. It's the same guy. It's a well-respected scientist called Blaise Pascal. But he said something very profound. What he said was that life's so short compared to eternity that if there's even the slightest chance that there might be a God and the slightest chance that what we do in this life affects our eternal destiny, then it's well worth devoting our entire lives to finding out if there is a God and to trying to obey God if there is one, which stuck with me. I did find it quite profound at the time, and even now, our lives are short, really, compared to eternity that it promises us in the Bible that we can have. Life might seem quite long at times, and I used to play Monopoly on my own, but compared to eternity, it really is nothing at all. I can see the wisdom in what Blaise Pascal said, and it's a good aspiration that stuck with me to this day, to try to live your life devoted to God. Matt said I should try and have 3 topics. Well, I've had the introduction, which I've just given you, and then there's 2 more topics. But the first topic is evidence from people. So you'll see here familiar words about Jesus' death and then resurrection. They're so familiar, these words, that we can gloss over them and not really pay attention to the detail. But it's quite extraordinary, some of the things said here. So the earth quaked, rocks were split, bodies of the saints who'd fallen asleep were raised. This is amazing. No one that would have been around at the time would have ever forgotten this. For them, it would have been entirely rational to think that something special was going on. Jesus was God, and God was in action at that time. Crazy things going on. And then we see about Jesus' resurrection. Again, lots of daring do. There's a stone moved from the tomb. There's an angel there. It's amazing. It's not only amazing to read the events that occurred there that we see in the Gospels here, but also to read about how the disciples were transformed from being despondent when Jesus died to being fervent for their faith when they saw Jesus rise from the dead. There was no doubt in their minds it was utterly rational to follow Jesus. It would have been ludicrous to them to have thought that they shouldn't follow Jesus and that their faith was worth nothing. No one in that context surely would have been an atheist in light of that evidence. So that's Jesus. I come next on to Saul, otherwise known as St. Paul. So we read in Acts about his conversion. We can read about it in 3 different places because it's mentioned 3 different times in Acts. But within Acts, it describes Paul's conversion along the Damascus Road coming into Syria. But we don't know quite where it is along the Damascus Road. We know it's coming into Damascus itself. But here's a photo of what part of the Damascus Road looks like now. So maybe it occurred somewhere that looked a little bit like this. So for Paul, he was persecuting the church up to this moment. He definitely wasn't a friend of Jesus. He was not going to follow the faith at all up to this point. But we read here crazy things. There's a light from heaven, heard a voice. He went blind for 3 days. It's just amazing. All his arguments against the faith evaporated in light of what he saw here, having met with God. And that's useful for us nowadays, I think. There's all sorts of reasons people quote for not being a Christian. People talk about why there's still suffering in the world and why some prayers aren't answered. And we don't really know the answers to these questions, and they're bigger topics than I can deal with in this talk. But if you experience God in the way Paul does, there'd be no doubt in your mind that although we don't understand everything, there's surely God there acting, creating things like this, the dramatic incident that Paul went through. I'd be shortchanging you if I gave a talk on faith and reason and didn't mention this guy. This guy was born in Ireland. He had a huge role on influencing Christianity in the last century. He was C.S. Lewis. He talks about how he came to faith, and he was the most reluctant convert in all of England, he says. He didn't want to be a Christian, but the more he thought about the faith, the more he reasoned it made sense, and he couldn't make sense of life without God. There's a whole bunch of C.S. Lewis doodles on YouTube. Thanks, Brian, for showing me about them. They really bring to life C.S. Lewis's works. Within them, someone narrates a chapter from one of Lewis's books, and someone else illustrates them at the same time. And here's one doodle that I've found. I'll show you now.
Everyone has heard people quarrelling. Sometimes it sounds funny, and sometimes it sounds merely unpleasant. But however it sounds, I believe we can learn something very important from listening to the kinds of things they say. They say things like this: "How'd you like it if anyone did the same to you?" "That's my seat. I was there first." "Leave him alone. He isn't doing you any harm." "Why should you shove in first?" "Give me a bit of your orange. I gave you a bit of mine." "Come on. You promised." People say things like that every day. Educated people as well as uneducated. And children as well as grown-ups. Now, what interests me about all these remarks is that the man who makes them is not merely saying that the other man's behaviour doesn't happen to please him. He's appealing to some kind of standard of behaviour which he expects the other man to know about. And the other man very seldom replies, "To hell with your standard." Nearly always he tries to make out that what he's been doing doesn't really go against the standard, or that if it does, there is some special excuse. He pretends there is some special reason in this particular case why the person who took the seat first shouldn't keep it, or that things were quite different when he was given the bit of orange, or that something has turned up which lets him off keeping his promise. It looks, in fact, very much as if both parties had in mind some kind of law, or rule of fair play, or decent behaviour, or morality, or whatever you like to call it, about which they really agreed. And they have.
So within that, Lewis talks about how all cultures are different across different places and different times, but what they have in common is the view that there's an absolute morality, that we should all do good in whatever sense that's expressed in our given culture. But the fact that he thought there's an absolute morality that's true across all times and all places made him think that there was a God. And then in his famous trilemma, he talks about how Jesus can't just be moderately important. He can't just be a good man. Jesus claimed to be God, so either he was, or he was mad or bad. So for C.S. Lewis, there was no option but to follow Jesus as God. Everything else was irrational. You might say it's all very well for C.S. Lewis, but he lived a long time ago. We know a whole lot more about science now. We have more information to shape our discussions on how old the universe is. We know a whole lot more about the universe, and particularly we learned about DNA. We understand how DNA causes our bodies to form. So you might say, would a thinker now become a Christian in light of what we know in our day and age? Well, Exhibit A is Francis Collins, who is head of the Human Genome Project. So the project was designed to investigate these little lines in the DNA, or the base pairs, and trying to sequence the DNA across a whole human set of genomes. He was a proud scientist, and he was an atheist, and he felt that everything he believed could be justified through facts and reason, till someone challenged him on his faith. And the more he thought it through, in his biography here, The Language of God, the more he realised that he hadn't really thought through the spiritual aspect of his life. So he set out to explore what various faiths taught, and the more he thought about it, the more he realised that the faith in God seemed much more rational than the atheism he had beforehand. A lot of the arguments against faith, he found, were defeated by C.S. Lewis's writings. Lewis had gone through a similar train of thought beforehand and knocked back a lot of the arguments that had stopped Francis Collins from being a Christian. One of the points Collins mentions was that you can't explain everything by evolution alone without there being a God. And through this process, he described in his book how he became a Christian, because that seemed the rational option. Just looking at it from a scientific point of view, he had to discard his atheism because a faith in God was far more rational. So that's evidence from people. Now on to evidence from the universe. So how did the universe form? Well, we know some things about how it formed through the Big Bang. We don't understand everything. We don't understand entirely what was around before the universe, but it seems to me that there's two options. Either some power, Christians would call God, created a universe from nothing, or that nothing created the universe from nothing. These are your two options, and I know where my money lies. Here's a photo of a nebula taken from the James Webb Space Telescope. And the grandeur of the universe is apparent to me here. It's amazing. You think our sun is 100 million miles away from us, yet we can still feel its heat on Earth. What a huge amount of power that sun must be emitting. Yet you can see in this photo, if you've got enough resolution on your screen, millions of stars, all with a similar amount of power. Well, that's a huge amount of power in the universe. It's mind-boggling. It strikes me that God that's in charge of this is a God with a lot of power at his disposal. If you ever wonder if God has enough power to answer the prayer that you're asking, well, just look out the universe to see the power in the universe. It's astonishing. And the psalmist here that wrote Psalm 19 was probably looking out to space, seeing some stars when he wrote these words. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Well, he wouldn't have been able to see any stars in this much resolution, but this was the sort of thing he would have been thinking of at the time. So from the big to the small, we now look at DNA. We see here a chunk of DNA from a human cell. In each cell in our bodies, it's amazing. There's 3 billion base pairs. Those are little half lines that you see going across the screen here. It's amazing to me how much detail there is stored in our bodies in each cell. And again, that's something God ultimately is in charge of. So if you ever wonder if God will answer your prayer, because your prayer seems to be about something so small and insignificant, well, consider this detail that God's in charge of. It really is quite mind-boggling for another reason, going from the big to the small. In his book, Just Six Numbers, Martin Rees, who was the astronomer royal, describes 6 numbers that govern how our universe forms. And here they are on the screen. I'm not going to describe them in detail, but if you're interested as to what the numbers are conceptually, here's what they are. And he describes how remarkably fine-tuned our universe seems to be. If these numbers were out by a slightest percentage, or even a tiny fraction of a percentage, then life would never have been able to form. If one of these numbers was out by a little bit, gravity would be either too weak for planets to form in the first place, or too strong for intelligent life to be able to develop. It really does look spot on, so much so that scientists think it's a bit spooky. So even Stephen Hawking says the values of these numbers seem very finely adjusted. For a lot of people, they look so spot on that our universe could only have been designed with those numbers by a God who wanted intelligent life to develop. The next section, rather, is quite technical, and I nearly left it out because it is a bit technical, but in the end, I figured it was misleading not to disclose this section. So if it's a bit too much, maybe you could pray for your neighbour in your road a minute whilst I go through this technical bit, and then listen later on. But some people say maybe it's not the case that the universe is fine-tuned and that there's only one universe out there, our universe. They say perhaps there's loads and loads and loads of universes out there that we can't see. And if you have enough universes, then surely these numbers would be just right to allow intelligent life to develop in one universe. Perhaps it's just a probability thing. It's not that there's something special about our universe. So I wanted to explain this in simple terms. So I'm going to use an object that we're all familiar with. So if you could imagine that our universe was a jammy biscuit sandwich or a JBS, how many biscuits, i.e. universes, would you have to make it credible that our universe just had the conditions to harbour intelligent life by chance? Well, you could fill a house from floor to ceiling in every room with these jammy biscuit sandwiches. And in fact, you could do that with every building in Yate. You could totally fill it with these biscuit sandwiches, and you still wouldn't get close to the number of universes you'd need before this theory was credible and that you don't need to invoke a god. In fact, you'd be able to fill all the fields in England with these sandwiches, and in fact, the entire length of Britain with these sandwiches, up to a mile deep, and you'd have to keep going. So I tried to get an AI website to show what this might look like, and it sort of had a go, and it kind of got it. And in fact, you could look at all the planets in our solar system, and you'd have to fill them entirely all the way through and miles high from the surface with these jammy biscuit sandwiches, and still you wouldn't have enough to make it credible that life just developed by chance because the parameters that I described earlier are just spot on. You'd have to fill the entire universe with nothing but these jammy biscuit sandwiches, because in fact you'd need more biscuits than there are atoms in the universe. So that seems crazy to me. It seems much more likely to me that there is something special about our universe, and that God visited it in the person of Jesus because he wanted to relate to us. If you've got other reasons why you believe, you can check out this page on our website where some people list their reasons why they're Christians. So that's the end of the talk, but in summary, if you're wondering what to talk about to someone about why you're a Christian, well, remember the experience that Jesus had, the amazing daring do when he rose from the dead, and St. Paul as well, that is experienced during his conversion. How astonishing that was. Remember C.S. Lewis's arguments and Francis Collins as well about how for them, the more they thought about the facts of morality or of science, it led them to believe that Christianity was true. And remember Pascal as well, how he said that life is so short compared to eternity, it's worth devoting your life to following God. Thank you for listening.